It was just after midnight in New York Harbor, and the city was still glowing the way only New York can glow, with lights on the water, steam in the air, and ships packed so close together that the harbor looked less like a port and more like a floating machine. Then, without warning, the night split open. A blast rolled across the water, hard enough to shake windows miles away, hard enough to wake families from sleep, hard enough to make men on the docks think, for one terrifying second, that New York itself was under attack. Fire shot into the sky, metal screamed, broken timber rained down, and somewhere in the darkness, people began to understand that this was not an accident. This was something planned, something hidden, something meant to hurt America. The place was called Black Tom, a small man-made island near Jersey City, New Jersey, tied to the mainland by rail and built for the simple purpose of moving freight. During peacetime, it was just another industrial corner of the harbor, the kind of place most people in Manhattan never thought about. But in the summer of 1916, Black Tom had become one of the most dangerous places in America. The United States was still officially neutral in the war raging across Europe, but neutrality was becoming a fragile word. Germany was trying to cut off supplies to its enemies. American factories were producing goods, ammunition, and explosives that traveled across the Atlantic. Harbor after harbor became a marketplace for war, and Black Tom was one of the busiest points in that supply chain. The dock was crowded with munitions, shells, detonators, and military freight waiting to be shipped. Workers came and went in the heat of summer, loading crates under sky that seemed too calm for the danger below it. Few of them knew how much power was stacked around them. Few of them understood how closely the World War had crept up to the edge of New York City. The war was happening overseas, people told themselves. It was an ocean away, Europe's problem, not ours. But war has a habit of crossing borders before anyone admits it has crossed them. On that July night, the first fire started small. A guard noticed something suspicious, and then the flames spread faster than anyone could react. Maybe it was a tossed cigarette, maybe a careless spark, maybe a deliberate act already in motion. The truth would take years to fully uncover, and even then, pieces of it would remain buried in secrecy, rumor, and legal fights. But once the fire reached the explosives, the harbor became a storm of destruction. Shells detonated in waves. Pressure slammed through the air. The shock hit the Statue of Liberty so violently that it damaged the monument and shattered windows in the surrounding area. In nearby buildings, people jolted awake and ran to the streets, half-dressed, stunned, staring at the sky. It felt less like an industrial accident and more like a siege. And that was exactly the point. What made Black Tom so alarming was not just the blast itself, but the idea behind it. This was sabotage on American soil, tied to a foreign power operating quietly inside the country. During World War I, German intelligence had been running secret operations in the United States for years. Their mission was simple in theory and ruthless in practice: disrupt the flow of ammunition and supplies to the Allied powers. If Germany could not stop American industry by diplomacy, it would try to stop it by fear. That meant explosions, fires, false papers, bribes, covert agents, and hidden networks that moved through port cities like shadows. Black Tom became one of the clearest signs that America's great Atlantic distance was no longer protection. The war had reached New Jersey. It had reached the harbor. It had reached the nation's largest city, and it had done so with terrifying precision. In the hours after the blast, investigators moved through smoke, broken glass, and twisted steel, trying to piece together what had happened. The scale of the damage was hard to believe. Freight cars had been blown apart. Nearby piers were wrecked. The harbor looked as if it had been struck by artillery. People began asking the obvious question: how could a place guarded by workers, police, and shipping officials end in such chaos? The answer came slowly, then all at once. This was not just fire. It was intent. It was the work of men who had planned to make the waterfront itself into a weapon. The investigation stretched on, and with it came a wider picture of the secret war being fought in the United States. There were German agents moving through ports, shipyards, and industrial districts. There were sympathizers, intermediaries, and men who knew exactly where to hide and when to strike. Some of the names connected to the sabotage network would later become part of court cases and diplomatic claims. One of the most famous figures tied to German covert operations in the United States was Captain Franz von Rintelen, who was linked to attempts to disrupt munitions shipments and stir sabotage inside America. The Black Tom explosion became one of the strongest examples of that hidden campaign. And still, for a long time, the American public did not fully understand the scale of what had happened. That is what makes Black Tom so eerie. It was not just the violence, it was the silence around it. A country that prides itself on knowing what is happening in its own cities suddenly found out that one of the biggest explosions in its history had been planned by outside actors moving under cover of ordinary commerce. The war had not arrived with uniforms on beaches or warships in the harbor. It had arrived through freight, through paperwork, through storage yards, through men who looked ordinary enough to pass anywhere. The statue that stood in the harbor, torch raised toward the sky, became one of the quiet symbols of the attack. The damage to the Statue of Liberty was repaired, but the image lingered. Liberty herself, rattled by a war she was not supposed to be part of. That image carried a deeper meaning for Americans. It suggested that neutrality had become a kind of illusion. The United States might not have been sending soldiers to Europe yet, but Europe's war was already shaping life in America in hidden ways. Steel, shipping, labor, immigration, politics, and profit were all tangled together. The harbor explosion exposed just how vulnerable that system really was. The investigation also pushed America toward a new understanding of security. Before World War I, the country had no modern intelligence culture in the way it would later develop. There were no giant security agencies with broad domestic coordination like Americans would eventually come to expect in the 20th century. But the sabotage at Black Tom, along with other wartime incidents, forced officials to think differently. If foreign agents could sneak into a harbor, plant destruction among shipments, and vanish into a crowd, then America needed better countermeasures, better records, better surveillance, and a stronger grasp of who was operating inside the country and why. The blast was a warning shot, and the country slowly began to hear it. One of the most startling parts of the story came after the war, when the legal and diplomatic aftermath revealed just how serious the event had been. Black Tom was not treated as a minor incident. It became part of a long-running international claim against Germany, and decades later, the United States received compensation tied to the sabotage. That alone tells you how significant the explosion was. This was not a forgotten warehouse fire. This was an act of war committed in the shadow of the Statue of Liberty. And yet, because it happened before America officially entered World War I, Black Tom never became part of the standard public memory in the way Pearl Harbor later did. There were no dramatic films built around it in the same way. There were no yearly ceremonies that made it a household name. It slipped into the cracks of history, known to specialists, historians, investigators, and the families who lived through the blast, but largely invisible to everyone else. That makes the story feel even darker. Some of the most important moments in history are not the ones everyone remembers. Sometimes the most important ones are the ones that almost disappear. What happened at Black Tom also revealed something unsettling about the modern world. The line between war and peace can break long before anyone declares it broken. The men on the docks were doing ordinary work. The ships were ordinary ships. The cargo was ordinary cargo, except it was ordinary cargo in a world that had become extraordinary with danger. A foreign intelligence operation had recognized what most people ignored. Harbors are nerves, rail lines are arteries, explosives are leverage. If you want to rattle a nation without invading it, you do not always need an army. Sometimes you only need access, timing, and patience. That is what made the explosion so haunting. It was not random, it was strategic. The night after the blast, the harbor looked almost unreal. Smoke drifted over the water. The wreckage glowed in the red light of fires that had not yet died down. Men stood among the debris trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. The city was still awake, but not fully aware. New York would keep moving as it always did, because New York has a way of swallowing disaster and pretending it is only weather. But under that motion, something had changed. The country had seen that it could be struck from within its own ports, by people who knew how to hide in plain sight. Years later, Black Tom would remain a footnote for many Americans, but for anyone who looked closely, it was never just a footnote. It was a clue. It was one of the earliest signs that the 20th century would not only be a century of armies and trenches, but also of spies, sabotage, coded messages, secret funding, industrial targets, and invisible wars fought inside open cities. The explosion in New Jersey was a preview of the age to come. And maybe that is the real reason the story still feels so unsettling today, because Black Tom was not just about what exploded. It was about what America failed to see until after the smoke had cleared. A nation thought it was standing safely outside the war. Then, in one terrible night, it learned that distance is not the same as safety, and neutrality is not the same as protection. That is the forgotten lesson of Black Tom. Not just that an explosion tore through New York Harbor, but that the modern world had already begun to arrive, and it came silently through the docks, through the paperwork, through the shadows, and finally, through fire.